The music business is in serious trouble. Or is it? That depends on your perspective. Let's talk about it. From New York City, this is How to Fix the Music Business, and I'm your host, Jim McDermott. We've heard this story so many times in the music business, it seems like a cliche. A kid turns on the TV on February 9th, 1964, and sees four musicians from Liverpool making their Ed Sullivan Show debut. As they take their first dose of Beatlemania, a light goes off in their head. This is what I want to do with the rest of my life. Music, rock and roll. These kids will grow up and maybe work at a radio station, a record company. They'll become writers and managers and photographers. Some of them will start bands that will go on to be hugely successful, and they'll shape the future of the music business. But one 5-year-old boy will hear the music of the Beatles and grow up to become a masterful vagabond of the guitar, playing on many hit records and thousands of gigs, until 40 years later, incredibly, he finds himself standing alongside Paul McCartney as a bandmate. My special guest today is that kid, obviously all grown up now, Rusty Anderson, lead guitarist for Paul McCartney. He's got a brilliant new album out with his band Rusty Anderson Afternoon called RAA, and we chat about how it came together. But Rusty's also here to share his thoughts on the state of the music industry today. You know, we hear a lot from record labels and technology companies about how things should work, what is and isn't fair about the music business. But we don't hear that often from the actual creators who give life to the music and how the changes are impacting them. We're going to try to get more artists into the mix on these issues on the podcast. For our first guest artist on the show, I'm really honored to welcome Rusty Anderson to How to Fix the Music Business. Welcome, Rusty.
My pleasure. Yeah, it should be fun, Jim.
I want to start with your new record, which was released in May this year on Oxide Records. Listening to it, I was amazed how sonically and musically accomplished it was. I mean, obviously you've played with an incredibly diverse amount of legendary musicians before you even met and started playing with Paul McCartney. But The record to me doesn't sound like a self-produced record. As somebody who spent a long time in the music business, it sounds like if I had been given this as an advanced cassette in the 90s and it was going to be the next big thing that we had to push, I would assume this was a record that cost $1 million to make and was going to have a huge marketing budget behind it and had a lot of accomplished players on it. How did you manage to self-release and self-produce a record that sounds so not self-produced?
Well, first of all, that's very kind of you. Yeah, I have my own studio at my house, and we've actually moved houses. So some of it was recorded in different areas. Some was recorded at the last studio. Some was recorded at the new studio. And also it was co-produced with, let's see, Greg Collins being the main guy. Some good friends of mine that I share a studio with, Aaron and Robbie Martirosian, were part of the production. So I think we've incorporated it. Now, also let me back up and say that this is a band.
Yep.
And which is primarily Todd O'Keefe and myself. So that's part of the sound, obviously, because Todd and I are both singing and both writing songs, and he plays bass, I play guitar. But, you know, you mix it up a bit. There's some other different musicians on there. And I think there's a producer mind that I'm coming from after working on my own various records for many years and playing in the studio with a bunch of different people and working with Paul. And, you know, I have some accumulated experience in that world. So I think there's no way to avoid it. I mean, anybody who puts out a record is going to be pretty damn involved in the production, I would think. Now, occasionally you get the people that'll just come in and sing and leave, which is fine. But then you're really just leaving it up the whole direction and so many factors up to the producer. And for my world, the schedule, you know, spending a lot of time on the road with Paul, it doesn't really make sense to try to coordinate with a whole bunch of people's schedules and all that kind of stuff either.
You mean in terms of like booking studio time ahead of time, like at a place where you've got to pay X $100 an hour type of thing? Or is it just easier because you have your own place and you can just switch everything on and leave the board the way it is until you've got the time when you're home kind of thing?
Yeah, that kind of thing. And then working with Greg, he has his own studio, so those drums are cut over at his studio, and he's really really good. And it just sort of little by little, it finally came out, which is always an amazing thing. I think Picasso said, "Art is never finished; it's just abandoned." Basically. And that's at some point you just kick it out the door and say it's done. So I think when you look at the actual nuts and bolts of any organization or any accomplishment, any business, any art that gets finished, it's more of a chaotic process than people would ever imagine because it has the illusion of this integration and the illusion of this finished product, a grocery store, whatever it is. You know, you look at the heart of it, there's probably a lot of drama and chaos going on. That's my observation over the years, anyway.
Well, that's making records, right? And sometimes out of that chaos comes really amazing things. But when I listen to your record, it sounds to me cohesive. It sounds like it's a fully finished thought. The pacing of it, sonically, it's not like, oh, I could tell one track was kind of recorded here and it sounded a certain way spatially, or the dynamics were a certain way, and then on another track it's really different. It sounds like it's got flow and it was a complete rendered thought. I think it's your most accomplished record.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, listening to it, the thing that to me that you can tell makes a great record is when you put it on and you're listening to it and the last song comes on, you're like, oh, that was really short. What is it, an EP? And then I look and it's actually 9 tracks. After Danny the Doubler ended, I thought my Spotify connection had terminated. How did you manage to get a record that clearly has a lot of your influences kind of woven into it, have this be a band, record it on the fly, but have it sound so cohesive and so much like a record that had a long time for you guys to sit down and riff it and work it out? I mean, because if it was done piecemeal at all, it really doesn't sound like it.
Well, the thing is, it's super piecemeal because the last record was actually, we called it an EP. It's sort of like the difference between an EP and a record is kind of subjective these days. I think England has some sort of like, if it's 26 minutes, then it's an album. If it's less, it's an EP or whatever they're
for the charts. Yeah.
Yeah. But actually, anyway, that one was called Rusty Anderson Afternoon 2.
And it was 6 tracks, I think, right?
5 or 6, yeah. And then this one is called RAA. And basically, they could be one big record. But 2, I thought, was called 2 mostly because those songs were primarily written after 1, or after the one we just released. So they're kind of chronologically backwards, but it's not that clear cut. And also, calling it 2 is nice because it fit in with the artwork. Yeah. Something somehow made sense at the time. But yeah, I think you just try to make it have the feel of a cohesive record. And there's a lot of choices that go into editing, I mean, a movie or a record to give it cohesion. Basically, we just follow our muses. And that's what I finally succumbed to. I mean, there's bands like, say, AC/DC or Kiss or something, or a lot of EDM music where it's all sounds like each song sounds very much like the last song.
Yep.
And that's not where I come from. I come from more of that sort of free form renaissance of the 60s. And especially being that I work with Paul McCartney, he's like the most diverse artist in the universe. And it's almost to the point, I mean, you think about the White Album, you had Blackbird and Helter Skelter on the same record. And I think that's kind of awesome because if you look at someone's playlist or whatever, no one has like all reggae songs or all heavy metal songs or all EDM or whatever. It's usually a diverse thing. That's anyway where we come from. So that's a huge compliment that that you think it's a cohesive record because really we just, like I said, follow our muses and it goes where it goes, and we make music that we like, and then the people that connect with it are the people you're meant to connect with, and I think that's the organic process and quality that we appreciate.
Well, the diversity thing is an interesting question because I guess the 60s was a time of experimentation and the people that were running things didn't really know it was going to work. So you had movies like Easy Rider come out and it was a huge hit, and the guys in charge of Hollywood said, I don't get it. Give these hippies more money because I can't figure it out. Maybe they must know something I don't know. And I think that happened in rock and roll a lot too. Now it's weird because there is a lot of samey sounding stuff in pop music, but the walls have come down in terms of the ability to self-release and be diverse in your creativity. And not everybody takes advantage of that opportunity.
Hmm.
Do you have any thoughts on that one way or the other in terms of, well, I mean, we'll get into discussing how it was when you were on, on a major and you're with Edner Swap and stuff. But now that
Hmm.
you're kind of your own A&R man and nobody's telling you what to put on the record, what's that like for you?
Well, it's mostly just necessary, and it's great. And given my life, that it's sort of split between going out touring with Paul McCartney and doing recordings with him, and working on my own stuff. And then we do gigs. Rusty Anderson Afternoon does some shows, and I have a life. I have a family. Deal with my taxes and all the other stuff. It's like that's kind of the way it has to work. It's not like I'm trying to get rich and famous. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's more like make great art, because you can sit there and chase trends all day long. I don't think it's necessarily a good idea. I've never really been like that, because I guess I'm too selfish, maybe. Music's too personal to me to kind of take that approach. That makes sense. You don't want to violate your own taste range, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but you have to have taste in the first place. If you are trying to be rich and famous, then there are blueprints certainly that exist in pop music for going that route, and there's all sorts of songwriters you could have hired in Scandinavia to write this record for you, and you didn't, obviously. But I do hear when I listen to your record, it's weird listening to it, and I'm hearing all these flavors that are recalling things that I've listened to in my musical life, and they're not quite references, but it's like they're ingredients in the mix, but it's not like you're trying to sound like anybody else. So the pleasurable thing about listening to it is if you're someone who has a wide taste in music throughout history, when I listen to your record, it's comfortable to listen to it, but it isn't like, oh, here's the tune where you're trying to cop this or
Right.
that. And it's not like, oh, I'm in McCartney's band, so here's my Beatlesy sounding record, because that's what you would expect. Does that just come out of you because of the different people that you've played with over, I mean, what is it now? 35 years being a professional musician? 40
Yeah,
years?
however scary long it is.
Yeah.
I guess so. I mean, basically, I've been doing the same thing since I was 5. I've been, trying to play guitar, been interested in playing guitar, been interested in music and singing and writing and bands and musicians and recordings and live and various forms of that. So yeah, it's been a while, and I just sort of, like I said, it's like I think each record is trying to achieve a new goal. Like you have this sonic palette in your head and this feeling that you get from the music, and you're trying to achieve that. And the next one's going to be what it's going to be, and it'll probably be pretty different. Yeah, I can't even really comment. I think I'm too close to all that to say. I have worked with a lot of different artists in the studio, that's for sure. Everyone from like Elton John, Sinead O'Connor, Perry Farrell, Dido, so many people.
The Bangles, the New Radicals. I mean, the
Yeah.
Bangles. It's funny. I was working in a record store when different light came out, and the guitar playing on that is incredible. What tracks did you play on that record?
Most of them, to some extent, I do overdubs. So, like, say something like "If She Knew What She
Yeah,
Wants" or "September Girls" was a lot of me. Where, say, "Manic Monday," I played all the acoustic guitars. What was another one? "Walk Like an
yeah.
Egyptian." I think I played power chords or something. I might have played that riff at the end. Da, 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 da. I don't even really remember. It was so long ago. But yeah, so it's all an interesting trajectory that you can never predict in this life.
When you're sitting down to put out a record, because you've talked about the creative aspects of what it satisfies within you, but from a businessman standpoint, do you sit down and come up with a P&L at any point and say, okay, here's what I'm going to budget for recording it, and here's what I'm going to allocate to marketing? And do you have business goals at all when you put out the records, or is it like, this is something I enjoy doing and I'm going to do it, and I'm not overly concerned with what the commercial results are?
Well, I guess I try to pretend that I have a master plan and have some sort of outline. I enjoy making lists. It's always kind of fun because then it starts to make it all real and make it manifest. But it's like any construction job you do. It always goes over budget, and always takes longer, and always run out of money and stuff like that. It gets done one way or another.
So I met you, although probably I know you don't remember it, and I barely remember it. But I met you actually at a NARM convention
Oh yeah.
in 1996 in Orlando, Florida, when Edna Swap did a showcase, and we cybercast it. I was doing new media at Polygram at the time, and we were on a bill with Hanson and Chris Bodie.
Wow. Good memory.
Yeah, well, I remember it because for a few reasons. Tony Levin played with Chris Bodie at that gig, and I got to geek out on King Crimson with him for a little while, which was amazing. But
Yeah.
um,
Hmm.
what was it like being on the label side, like getting the push, getting the big advance, having all the label guys, the have a cigar vibe behind it? What was that like relative to doing it all yourself?
It's, I guess, you never know where it's going to go. I mean, like you say, with Edna Swap, we put out 3 or 4 major label records. I think one of them was an EP. Uh, with first it was Electra East West,
Yeah.
and then it was with Island, and it was an interesting ride. I mean, I sort of learned a lot. It was sort of a circus dog and pony show with all these different people in the business spinning their heads around doing this and that. I think a lot of them had no clue what they were doing, and some of them really did. But ultimately, you're just guessing at the direction of where music's going to go. And I sort of sat back a little bit and watched it all happen because none of it was really clear to me what was happening. And I think it wasn't really clear to anybody. You just try to figure it out as it's going. And that's the strange thing about it. And I guess that's a nice thing about these days putting out a record. I don't have any real, like I said, I'm not trying to be the next big thing or try to be rich and famous or whatever. I just love music and I love making music and I love connecting with people. So that's what I focus on. All that other stuff, it was a trippy time. I mean, we were driving around in a couple vans and it was an intense, like that gig that we did that you worked on. I mean, that was in the middle of a very intense tour, and it was just wham, bam, bam, bam. And it's hard to remember any of it because it's so dense and so sort of so many new things. It thrust at you at once. But it was also an interesting band in the respect that it was 5 really strong personalities all together. And I think it was ultimately too much for itself. It was sort of a 5-headed monster. And we had a lot of fun. We learned a lot. But there was a lot of sort of driving in around in a van and arguing and playing gigs in the snow, and it's just it's not for the faint of heart, that kind of thing. Let me put it that way.
Did you guys make money from selling records? Make money from touring? Make no money? End up owing the label money? Like in the final accounting of it, what was your experience with
Oh, I
that?
don't think that we recouped. I mean, that's the big thing is that record companies, they take bands take advance back then. Bands would take advances. It was a bubble going on. You have to remember. So the music business, like in the '90s, was selling the most CDs it ever sold,
Yeah.
and then in the early 2000s or whenever, it sort of fell off a cliff. Because people couldn't go and listen to songs like one song. You'd hear it on the radio and go, "Oh, that's a great song." You'd buy the record and you'd love that song, and then you'd hate the rest of the CD, and they were like almost $20. And so all these people had put out $20 for one song, basically, and there was only one way to do it, and that's the way you did it. Nowadays, it's completely different. So the record companies would make a ton of money off these big artists, the ones that actually did recoup, which was most of them. Like I think it was 1 in every 200 or something actually recouped in
Yeah.
the '90s.
Yeah.
So you think about those odds. There was a lot of bands that were tax write-offs or whatever, and then you'd have U2 or the Police or something that would make all this money for the record company, and then they had a few bands that almost recouped or but you have to remember that recouping meant they were taking all sorts of liberties and lots of lunches and all these expenses and record breakage and stuff, and the bands are getting stuck with it. So the deal was really sweet for the record companies, and the bands, it was pretty brutal. I mean, you have to be huge to make any money. You'd have to be really huge. So yeah, now I think it's much more humble for everybody, but it's still screwball. I think it's still a wacky business, as it always was. And I think part of the reason is like even things like, you know, here we are arguing about infrastructure, like having your garbage taken out, or your fire department, or your police, you know, your basic things that everybody needs, right? Those things, they're necessities. And even those are people arguing about if we should pay for them. I mean, I heard in Australia that if you have a fire, you basically sit there with a hose by your house and you fend it off yourself. I don't know if that's a rumor, but you have these things that are unarguably necessities, roads, doctors, dentists, whatever. Somehow they have to get paid, and people have to, you have no choice. Music is more of this luxury, if you want to look at it that way. It's just no one needs music. You can survive without it. I think for me, it's made my life. It's a beautiful thing. It's a wonderful thing, and I love it, and it makes it magical, and it makes me feel alive. But it's not necessarily a necessity for life. And so, how do you fund the music business? Is really the ultimate question. How is it dealt with? Once it fell off the cliff from the big period of selling the most CDs ever to all of a sudden the digital age came and downloads and stuff, and it's and pirating, and people are giving things away. It's just a different world now.
It must be amazing for you looking at it through your lens, because you're going out and doing regular gigs with the greatest living legend of rock and roll on the planet, playing in front of massive, massive audiences. There's probably a lot of people out there who go like, oh, well, you know, he can put out his records and he can do his thing because he plays with McCartney, and I'm sure the door's just open for him. But you've got to go out and market and develop your own audience for your own music and make it happen. And I'm sure that being a part of Paul's world and the proximity you have to him and his involvement in some of your projects has been a great help. But at the end of the day, you still have to do all that work to engage with your fans and make things happen for your own music, right?
Absolutely. Definitely. You know, I've had some songs get played on the radio, like "Effortless" was. I think it even reached #1 on a Sirius station, as that was from the last EP.
Mm-hmm.
Song called "Effortless," and a song called "Where Will We Go" was in I think it was AAA, a bunch of stations, and that got up to number something or other, 20 or 30 or something. That got some airplay, and that's good, you know, and you just try to kind of keep all these things moving and get the word out there and on the internet. And you're right. It's like, it's up to me. I just do the best I can and try to enjoy the process, because ultimately that's what it is. It's a process. And I think it's a really different world now, because you can kind of walk down the street of any neighborhood and you figure every fourth house will have like a digital audio workstation in a bedroom where someone's recording the new album.
Yeah.
So it's a far cry from like the 50s or 60s or whatever, where you had like this, maybe 50 records of major label records a year put out, and then a couple of weird little indies indies didn't even survive back then. They had almost nothing, you know, it wasn't even such a thing, barely. But you'd have a very limited amount of artists that actually got to make a record, and all those records came out in this limited record store with these limited amount of artists. Cut to, like, instead of 50 or 100 a year, there was probably, you know, 50 million a year, 100 million a year.
Yeah.
So it's a really different world now, and yeah, we're all sort of doing the Wild West thing.
How do you feel about the business right now?
Well, I feel lucky enough to kind of have had all these different experiences. I mean, I don't know. I don't mind. I mean, it's the thing that's scary, I think, is how, like, the other day I was walking down the street and I walked past this club in Cleveland, and you know, I was on the road with Paul, and there was this DJ in there, and they were playing this music, and just anything that goes dum, 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 you know, anything that does that, automatically the kids are dancing, you know, the lights are colored going, and it's the DJ walks in with a laptop under his arm, and that's about it. It's a very different world, and I think just I like, if you deconstruct music, I like the instruments, people playing the instruments, seeing people playing the instruments, seeing them singing, seeing the distance of their lips from the microphone and their voice and the technique of that, all the art and the craft that goes into each musician playing an instrument. And that's kind of where I come from. That's what I enjoy. I mean, I get the immediate gratification of just hearing a beat and dancing to it and calling it a day, getting your drink on. And that's cool too. I can't say anything bad about it, but it's just really not my aesthetic as much. Um, so I can't even like try to fathom where it's going. It has to keep changing because everyone's older brother or sister has their music, and you want your own identity that's different from your older siblings or your parents. So everyone's kind of looking for something that they can put their mark on and identify with. And at the end of the day, it's all kind of just sounds that exist, pitches that exist in time. So you've got pitch and time, and that's about it. Anything else, you know, is sort of icing on the cake. Otherwise, that's what you say. That's my music because you can hear it. I think music has to be heard. I mean, John Cage had a song that had no sound. But if
Yeah.
you just break it down to what it is, music can go anywhere. I think that as far as the business goes, you look at Canada, and they have a lot of they sort of stick up for the artists, Canadian artists. They say a friend of mine told me he was touring in a band, and they couldn't go into Canada because they weren't the headliner, and they for the opening act they needed to use a Canadian band, so they couldn't even get through the customs to go in. But in a perfect world, I think in my imaginary fake perfect world for musicians, you'd have this great worldwide organization that maybe was funded by the governments and by maybe a little bit of dues from the musicians, something like that. And basically, it would be a collection of attorneys and CEOs that were all altruistic and actually had the greater good of the organization and the musicians and the audience in mind. This whole collective music experience, the point of keeping it all healthy and protecting musicians against all the awful deals that you can still get into. Some of these 360 deals, or some of these aggregators that take your sound exchange, people want to take publishing. There's a bunch of crooks out there, and I think people are getting more desperate because the business is so weird now and so diverse and so dispersed, and it's just like it's turned into little like thousands of pennies of on Spotify that so that YouTube. I mean, these companies just really don't pay almost anything. So this imaginary giant worldwide conglomerate that's altruistic and had the musicians' best interest in mind would protect everybody from these horrible deals and keep it all in sync and give people, like an even playing field to be able to create their art in. So everybody would get rewarded, but people wouldn't be getting maybe as filthy rich, and other people wouldn't get as ripped off. But the problem is that like going back to the commodities of, the basics of life, like a police department or a fire department or doctors or, getting your sewage treated or whatever, paying for those kinds of things, those are necessities in the music business. In a way, it's just like, back in the old day where you have like the paupers playing music, unless the king gives you a gig and then dictates what you need to sound like. There's similarities kind of throughout the histories of music because music is such a pure thing. It's created from the heart, in my opinion. The best music it's inspired. It's created from this vision. You can't just fake a vision and have it sound good. I mean, unless you're just recycling music and just, pushing a button and adding a few elements together that already existed. You can't really make inspired music without being inspired.
But also there's that old song, "You don't miss your water until your well runs dry," right? And
Right.
and yes, people need their garbage and their fire and their roads and everything. And there's some people who actually think the government shouldn't do anything. But then if those things weren't there, they would go, "Hey, where's my water? How come nobody's picking up my garbage? There's rats everywhere. There's the plague." Um,
Right.
and I think similarly with music, if all of a sudden there was no music, I
Uh-huh.
think people would say, "Hey, I need this as much as I need roads and someone to pick up my garbage and someone to make sure that my house gets put out when it's burning." It sounds as though what you're talking about is some kind of hybrid of modern day patronage mixed in with social justice, where musicians are allowed to create and exist and be for the greater good of society and aren't taken advantage of, which would be great. I mean, I do agree with you that maybe music now doesn't need to be a product. Maybe the time for that is past, but the time for music will never pass.
People always make music. People always want to hear it. It's just what form it takes and how to monetize it. Monetizing it is something that the musicians and the songwriters are interested in, and obviously the business people. If there were no business people, then people would do it themselves if there was some sort of pre-made path to follow. If you could just go, okay, my record's done. Input 1, 2, and 3, ABC, boom, okay, it's done, now it's out. And then you bypassed all the business people completely. That would be kind of cool. I think the problem is that also, you have this horrible law, I think that just went into effect with the who was it now? It affects the.
You're talking about the consent decree and the 100%
yeah, the
publishing?
Consent decree. That's it. Yes. And basically, where they can force writers that work together, in order to work together, they have to be on the same PRO.
Yeah.
Right. And if you're not, then they can lowball the song and say, okay, well, you agreed to this, you didn't agree, but it doesn't matter because the guy agreed to the lowest rate. We're going to, it's a way for it appears to me anyway, it's a way for the media companies, the television, the movies, whatever, that ultimately those bean counters to get their numbers down, the less they have to pay for music. And it squeezes the heck out of everybody. So it's all those kinds of things are so complicated, and you can't sit there and be creative and write music and think about these things. And you can't do everything at once. I mean, you look at the 60s, everybody got screwed because it was like the Wild West, and all these people would come in, the Alan Kleins and the, Terry Knights and the whoever else would come in. And, Jimi Hendrix would just sign anything and go, hey, sure, yeah, let me just play my music. You know what I mean? Then the family has to clean up the mess.
Yeah.
After he passes away, and because it is a mess. It was just a mess created, and you have all these bitter people, the John Fogertys, and obviously the Beatles being the most high-profile thing with suing each other and going through this long process of untangling the craziness that was created.
Hey man, you could just go back to Louis Armstrong. It didn't start in the 60s. Like
exactly.
Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith and all the jazz musicians, and then all the rock and roll, Little Richard and Chuck Berry,
everybody,
and
yeah,
B.B. King, and just and Muddy Waters. All of those guys got screwed. All those guys got screwed. And in the context of the times, because where they were coming from, they didn't have much. So somebody said, "Hey, I'm going to pay your rent, and you can make a living, and here's a car." Maybe it seemed like, well, nobody else is going to give this to me, but they couldn't envision that. Hey, well, this Muddy Waters record or this Howlin' Wolf record is going to be making money 70, 80 years later, but the artist and his family isn't going to get anything out of that. So it's been a long history of the artist getting screwed. Maybe the only bright spots out of all this relative to that is that now at least you can have a relationship direct with your fans. So if a transaction happens, you've at least got a possibility of being the artist making that transaction directly and cutting out some of the people out of that chain that would have extracted a lot of the value of that relationship off the table before you even got that, right?
And the records I've been doing now, I've been releasing it through my own label, Oxide, and it's more work in a certain way with really sort of mundane, sort of librarian type things, but it's been a lot more rewarding because you feel this direct connect with everybody, and you actually see what gets done, and all the stuff that you didn't realize you were getting ripped off over, you can unrip off yourself. So that's a nice thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, if you were on a major and you sold 10,000 records, you'd owe the label money. But if you put out a record yourself and sell 10,000 records, I don't know, maybe you put 80 grand in your pocket.
Yeah, exactly.
The last question I have for you is, what record should people go out and buy right now? Something you love that you think your fans and people listening to this should go out and buy right now.
Well, most of the records that I think for me are tried and true are are pretty old. I love Skip James's record. Which one do I have? It's basically a compilation of the greatest hits of Skip James stuff. I think it's fantastic. You know, I just did a thing on one of my favorite records is Hot Rats by Frank
I
Zappa.
listened. It's a great podcast. People should check that out. I'll put that in the show notes because it's a really intriguing podcast.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Yeah. So Frank Zappa, Peaches and Regalia. I love a lot of his other earlier Mother stuff, like Freak Out is an amazing record. Axis Bold as Love by Jimi Hendrix is incredible. There's actually a track, it's more recent than 100 years ago, Band of Horses, No One's Gonna Love Me More Than I Do. It's a fantastic song. I sort of gravitate towards songs more than whole albums usually in this modern age. I really love the Miles Davis stuff that they used for Miles Ahead, that movie. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly listening to your records as much as you're known as being a guitar player and a very capable sideman. Your records clearly show that you're a song guy.
Yeah, you know, I think I've had so many sort of influences over the years. I mean, I love what inspires me. I love Snowflakes Are Dancing, which is an instrumental record. It's basically Debussy. That's why I got turned on to Debussy, who is basically probably my favorite composer. I love Gershwin. I love Debussy. I love Rachmaninoff, stuff like that. But this one it was done with electronics of
Talking about
1975.
Tamita?
Yeah, you say it, Tomita. And
Yeah.
and this is
Who died
this is done.
recently. He died recently.
Right, he
Yeah.
just passed away.
Yeah.
Wow, that was heavy. But he used mellotrons. He used I think Moogs and ARPs and really primitive monophonic and early I think all monophonic synthesizers and really primitive sequencers and things to make this music. And it's so organic. It's the most organic electronic music I think I've ever heard, and I love that sort of it may be 1974 or something. If it was 1970, it wouldn't have worked. If it was 1976, it wouldn't have worked because his latter stuff really suffered, I think, from the technology that came right after that. But I love that record, and I'm sort of a melody guy, although I love great rhythms, and I sort of I think I've been breaking music down into its sort of basic components and foundation lately to sort of deconstruct it. Because ultimately, I think what turns me on is making music that's new. And you can't really do something necessarily new because you can do something new, but it wouldn't necessarily be good. Or you could do something really good, but it wouldn't be new. And it's always that thing of trying to get the two to meet, to make something really good and catchy and have nice melodies and nice rhythms and lyrics, and to make it something that's new that hasn't been combined in that way before. So that's always the goal. And I hear different artists all the time. I'll listen to KCRW. I'm in Los Angeles.
Yep.
And when I'm on the road, I don't hear it really. And then I'll come home and listen to my car. And that changes every time I come home. One minute they're playing the Black Keys or Alabama Shakes. And next minute they're playing a bunch of groups I've never heard of that remind me of the late 80s with a few more production tweaks. But it's funny how cyclical music is.
And it's funny how if you actually listen to music, you realize that the people that say that there is no good music anymore are really, really wrong. There's a lot of great music out there.
There's fantastic music, and I think it just takes a lot more weeding through it because there's so much. I mean, it's an endless amount of music. If you have the wherewithal, the skills, the right websites to point you, or you just go through your YouTube rabbit hole, or listening on iTunes, or dare I say Spotify, whatever your poison is, to get there, you can find some amazing music. Absolutely.
Cool. Well, Rusty, listen, I want to thank you so much for being on the show and sharing your thoughts with us. Your experiences and through doing this for 40 plus years in the music business are really unique, and I know our audience really appreciates the time you spent with us. I do, and everybody should go out and get your record, Rusty Anderson Afternoon, RAA. You and your band put out an incredible work of art. It's sonically amazing. The songs are really strong, and wish you the best of luck.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you, Jim. Yeah, it was really a pleasure talking to you. You know what you're talking about, so it's nice to exchange ideas.
Cool. All right, that'll do it for this episode of How to Fix the Music Business. I'd like to thank once again our special guest, Rusty Anderson. Please visit his website, rustyanderson.com, and buy the CD. It's available exclusively on his website. Of course, you can get it from iTunes, and you can listen on Spotify, etc. But Buying it directly from the artist supports them in a way that really will make you feel good. So please do that. It's the right thing to do. And if you can take a minute to leave us a review on iTunes, just take 1 minute, leave us a positive review. I would really appreciate it. It helps elevate the visibility of the show and will enable me to keep bringing you great guests like Rusty today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm going to go put on a record, and we'll see you next time.